Ever since I can remember, there's been this hunger inside me. Not the kind you can sate with food or drink, but a craving for something deeper, something most people turn their eyes away from. My name is Pauline, and this is the story of how that hunger led me down a path I can never return from. I was never like the other kids. They found joy in playground games and laughter, but I found mine in solitude, in the quiet spaces where reality blurred just enough to let imagination take hold. It was during one of these solitary moments, flipping through an old anatomy book I'd found in our attic, that I felt the thrill of curiosity mixed with an unsettling fascination. The detailed illustrations of the human body, each organ, each vein and muscle, were more captivating to me than any fairy tale could ever be. I remember the first time I voiced this fascination out loud. It was at the dinner table, a rare occasion when we all sat together, my mother, father, and little brother. I blurted out how incredible it was that our bodies worked like complex machines, how I wondered what it would be like to see them from the inside. The silence that followed was deafening. My mother's fork paused mid-air, her eyes narrowing not with curiosity, but with something akin to fear. "Pauline, that's not normal," she said, her voice laced with a caution I didn't understand. My father changed the subject, and my brother giggled, thinking it was all a joke. But it wasn't a joke to me. That moment, their reactions, it was the first cut not on my skin, but in my heart. A chasm that whispered I wasn't like them, that my hunger for understanding the intricate dance of life and death was something to be ashamed of. That night, in the privacy of my room, I promised myself I wouldn't speak of it again. But silencing my words didn't quell my curiosity, it only drove it deeper, into places where daylight fears to tread. I began to seek out more, to learn in secret. The internet became my teacher, guiding me through shadowed corridors of knowledge where the line between healing and harm blurred. As I grew older, this secret fascination became an obsession. I watched videos, read books, and filled countless notebooks with sketches and notes. All the while, I kept it hidden, knowing that to reveal this part of me would be to invite misunderstanding and judgment. I yearned for acceptance, for someone to see this part of me and not recoil in horror. I thought perhaps, in earning my mother's approval, I might find it. But some cravings, once awakened, can never truly be satisfied. And so, as I stand on the threshold of my darkest act, compelled by a twisted vision of love and acceptance, I can't help but wonder. Was this hunger always a part of me, waiting to be fed? Or was it the world's refusal to understand that nurtured it into something monstrous? This is my confession, my attempt to make sense of the senseless. Maybe, in sharing my story, I can find the peace I've been craving. Or maybe, I'll only find more questions. Either way, I need you to hear me, to see the world through my eyes. Only then can you understand why I did what I did. Welcome to my nightmare. Welcome to Scapel Dreams. Life in our suburban neighborhood could be a picture postcard for the word ordinary. Each house stood at just the right distance from the next, their lawns manicured to perfection, and every family seemed to play their part in this carefully constructed tableau of normalcy. My family was no different, or so it appeared. We lived in a modest two-story house, the kind with a white picket fence that my father insisted on painting every other year. It was as if the neighborhood association had handed out a checklist on how to be perfectly average, and everyone, including my parents, followed it to the letter. High school was an extension of this monotonous suburban life. The building itself was a blend of brick and indifference, standing as a monument to mediocrity. Inside, the halls echoed with the sounds of lockers slamming, teachers droning on about subjects I could hardly bring myself to care about, and students who moved in clusters, their conversations as insipid as the posters on the walls, proclaiming hollow messages of ambition and dreams. I moved through these days like a ghost, unnoticed and unremarkable. Teachers seldom remembered my name, and classmates rarely looked my way unless it was to comment on how quiet I was, as if my silence was an anomaly they couldn't quite understand. In this world of beige walls and fluorescent lights, I felt suffocated, craving something, anything, that felt real, that pulsed with life or passion or even genuine sorrow. But everything around me seemed coated in a veneer of complacency, leaving me to wander in a fog of disconnection. My peers were caught up in a never-ending cycle of superficial dramas, relationships that flickered and faded with the speed of social media updates, competitions for popularity that seemed as meaningless as they were relentless. I couldn't relate to their games, their easy laughter, or their obsession with fitting in. To me, it all seemed like a performance, a script they followed without questioning, leaving no room for anything that didn't conform to the norm. Home was no sanctuary, either. My parents were wrapped up in their own routines, my father always at work or busy with household projects on weekends, and my mother absorbed in her social circle and book club meetings. They were content with the surface level of life, never delving deeper, never questioning. Dinner conversations were a recitation of daily events, a ritual devoid of real connection. My attempts to share my thoughts or interests were met with puzzled looks or polite nods, further widening the gap between us. In this world of carefully curated normalcy, I felt like an alien, observing a life I was supposed to be a part of but never truly fitting in. The only place I found solace was in the quiet corners of the library, among the stacks of books that spoke of things beyond the suburban existence, of mysteries and sciences, of the inner workings of the human body, and of minds that dared to explore the darkness. It was here, in these moments of stolen peace, that I could almost believe there was more to life than the suffocating sameness. But each day, as I walked the familiar path home, past the identical houses with their welcoming lights and the illusion of art, I couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped in a life that was never meant for me. It was in this setting, this perfectly ordinary world, that my extraordinary obsession began to take root, finding fertile ground in my yearning for something more, something that would break the monotony and make me feel alive. The catalyst arrived on an otherwise unremarkable Thursday, during third period biology. Our teacher, Mr. Henley, announced we'd be starting dissections next week. There was a collective groan from the class, but within me, something else stirred, a spark of curiosity that felt like waking up from a long, dull dream. When the day of the dissection came, I was the first at my station, latex gloves on, scalpel in hand, with an eagerness that felt foreign yet thrilling. As Mr. Henley demonstrated the first incision on a frog, my classmates squirmed, some turning away in disgust, but I leaned in closer, captivated by the reveal of hidden anatomies beneath simple skin. It was as if I had been granted access to a secret world, a world that pulsed with the complexities of life itself. After that class, I couldn't shake the images from my mind. It wasn't the act of cutting or the sight of the insides that held me, it was the realization of how beautifully intricate life was, how every part connected and functioned with precision. This fascination drove me to the internet, where I began devouring everything I could find on human anatomy and surgical procedures. I watched videos of surgeries, entranced by the skill and steadiness required to navigate the human body, to fix what was broken, to save lives. Nights that were once filled with aimless scrolling through social media or watching TV shows blurred into hours spent on medical websites. I bookmarked pages on surgical techniques, read articles on the latest advancements in medicine, and fell asleep to lectures from renowned surgeons. It was a world where precision met passion, where every movement had purpose, and I was spellbound by the idea of being part of it, even if just as an observer. This newfound passion quickly became an obsession. I started sketching anatomical diagrams in the margins of my notebooks, my mind racing with ideas and questions. I imagined holding a scalpel, not with the intention to harm, but to heal, to discover, to understand. In these moments of deep fascination, I felt a connection to something greater than myself, a sense of purpose that had long eluded me in the monotony of suburban life. But with this obsession came a profound sense of isolation. My classmates couldn't understand my sudden interest in surgery and anatomy. They whispered behind my back, casting wary glances my way. Even my attempts to share this passion with my parents were met with concern rather than enthusiasm. They couldn't see the beauty and complexity I saw. To them, it was a morbid curiosity, a phase they hoped I would outgrow. Yet, despite their reactions, I couldn't suppress the fire that had been lit within me. Surgery, with its blend of art and science, became my refuge, a beacon in the fog of my existence. It promised a future where I could finally belong, where my curiosity and passion would be assets, not oddities. And so, I dove deeper into this. Their discomfort was palpable, a barrier as real as the walls of our high school. Lunch hours, once a neutral time of obligatory social interaction, became periods of exile. I sat alone, my company the diagrams and notes that spoke more to me than any conversation could. Their unease wasn't lost on me. I sensed their withdrawal, a collective stepping back, as if my fascination with surgery and anatomy was a contagious disease they feared catching. This alienation seeped into my home life, transforming it into yet another arena of solitude. My parents, initially puzzled by my newfound passion, grew increasingly alarmed. The books on medical procedures that piled up in my room, the surgical videos that played on my computer, sparked tense conversations that spiraled into arguments. "It's not normal, Pauline," my mother would say, her voice a mix of concern and reproach, as if my interest were a personal affront. My father, ever the peacekeeper, tried to bridge the chasm between us with awkward attempts at understanding, but his efforts felt hollow, widening the rift with every misunderstood gesture. Their discomfort became a silent, omnipresent force in our home, a fog of disapproval that settled over every interaction. Dinner conversations, once mundane but peaceful, turned into minefields. Simple questions about my day were loaded with a weight of unspoken fears. I learned to navigate these treacherous waters with monosyllabic answers, keeping my true thoughts and feelings submerged beneath a calm exterior. But inside, I was screaming, desperate for someone to see past the surface, to understand the depth of my passion. The isolation at school mirrored the growing distance at home, each feeding into the other in a vicious cycle. My world shrank to the confines of my room, the only place where I felt free to explore my interests without judgment. It became my sanctuary and prison, the space where I could lose myself in study and speculation, but also where I felt the full weight of my loneliness. This solitude transformed me. What began as a fervent interest evolved into an obsession, filling the void left by lost connections. As the gap between me and everyone else grew, so too did my resolve. I clung to my passion with a defiant grip, a lifeline in a sea of misunderstanding. It was in this isolation that the seeds of darker fantasies were sown, watered by the silence and solitude that surrounded me. Unbeknownst to those who pushed me away, their rejection only fueled the fire within, driving me deeper into a world they couldn't or wouldn't understand. As the chasm between me and the rest of the world deepened, my mind began to wander down ever darker paths. The initial spark of curiosity that had been lit by a simple biology class dissection had grown into a roaring blaze, fueled by isolation and misunderstanding. My interest in surgery, once purely academic, began to morph into something more intense, more personal. I started to envision myself not just as a student of anatomy, but as a surgeon in my own right. These weren't just idle daydreams, they felt like glimpses of a potential future, one where I wielded the scalpel, where my hands could alter fate. In the quiet of my room, surrounded by medical textbooks and the glow of the computer screen, I began to imagine scenarios where I could use my knowledge to fix the people around me. These thoughts were initially jarring, but they quickly became intoxicating. I envisioned scenarios where I corrected what I saw as flaws or imperfections in those I knew, believing that such acts would serve as undeniable demonstrations of my skill and, by extension, my worth. In my mind's eye, I saw their initial horror replaced by gratitude, their disdain turned to admiration. This transformation would be my salvation, my path to acceptance and love. This delusion grew, fed by the loneliness and the relentless feeling of being misunderstood. I pictured my classmates, once wary and distant, now looking to me with respect and perhaps even affection, their attitudes changed by my interventions. My family, too, featured prominently in these fantasies. I imagined the shock and eventual understanding in my mother's eyes, as she finally saw my passion not as something grotesque, but as a gift. In these twisted daydreams, my actions bridged the gulf between us, drawing us closer than we'd ever been. The more I indulged in these fantasies, the more detailed they became. I found myself sketching out plans, poring over my books not just for knowledge but for inspiration. Each imagined operation became a masterpiece, a step on the journey toward the acceptance I craved. The loneliness that had once felt suffocating now served as the canvas for my dark imaginings, each one a stroke of brilliance that only I could appreciate. Yet, even as these fantasies grew more vivid, a part of me remained anchored in reality. I understood, on some level, that these were not plans but desperate wishes. Still, the line between what was real and what was imagined began to blur. The more I was pushed away by those around me, the more enticing the world of my fantasies became. It was a place of power and control, a stark contrast to the powerlessness I felt in my daily life. This shift marked a dangerous turning point, the moment when the seed of a horrifying idea took root in the fertile ground of my alienation and longing. Within the sanctuary of my room, amidst a solitude that both comforted and tormented me, I began to pour my soul into a leather-bound journal. It was an ordinary notebook on the outside, but within its pages, it held a world that was uniquely mine, a world where my deepest, darkest fantasies took form. This journal became the vessel for my thoughts, a place where I could express my desires without fear of judgment or misunderstanding. Each night, under the dim glow of my desk lamp, I sketched and wrote with a fervor that consumed me. My pen danced across the pages, tracing the outlines of imagined surgeries, detailing procedures with an accuracy born of endless research and observation. These weren't mere drawings, they were plans for transformation, for making the imperfect perfect. The margins of these pages were filled with notes, musings on the nature of beauty and perfection, and reflections on how my work could alter the course of someone's life. The people who populated my school and home life, who had once seemed so distant and indifferent, now played starring roles in the scenarios I created. I wrote about them not with malice, but with a misguided sense of purpose. In my journal, I imagined myself as their savior, altering their destinies with my scalpel. These writings were a mix of technical precision and emotional longing, a testament to my belief that through these actions, I could forge connections that had eluded me in the real world. As the entries grew in number and detail, so too did the line between fantasy and reality begin to fade. What started as a way to escape my isolation became something more, a blueprint for achieving the acceptance I yearned for. I convinced myself that if I could just bring these fantasies to life, I would no longer be the outcast, the misfit. Instead, I would be recognized for my talents, my vision. But the journal was more than just a collection of disturbed writings, it was a mirror reflecting the depth of my loneliness and despair. With every page, I became more detached from the world around me, sinking deeper into a realm of my own creation. The act of writing and sketching became as vital to me as breathing, a necessary ritual to appease the growing darkness within. Yet, even as I indulged in these fantasies, a small part of me remained tethered to reality, aware on some level of the chasm I was creating between my desires and the world I lived in. This sliver of awareness, however, did little to slow the momentum of my obsession. Instead, it served only to deepen the secrecy with which I guarded my journal, making it the most precious and dangerous possession I had. It was both my confidant and my conspirator, a silent witness to the unfolding tragedy of my own making. The fragile equilibrium of my home life shattered one evening in an instant, the catalyst, a discovery that laid bare all the secrets I had held so close. It was a Tuesday, mundane in its routine, until the moment my mother ventured into my sanctuary under the guise of tidying up. Among the scattered textbooks and papers, she found the leather-bound journal that contained the essence of my hidden world. Her reaction was immediate and visceral, a mixture of shock and horror that etched itself into my memory. The pages I had filled with such care, each line a testament to my inner turmoil and longing, were now evidence of what she perceived as a deep and unsettling malice. She confronted me, the journal in her hands, her voice trembling with emotion. "Pauline, what is this? How could you even think these things?" I stood there, cornered by her disbelief and accusation, feeling the walls I had so carefully built around myself start to crumble. I tried to explain, to make her understand that these were not the ramblings of a disturbed mind, but the expressions of a soul searching for belonging and acceptance through an unconventional lens. But my words fell on deaf ears, drowned out by the tide of her preconceptions and fears. The argument that followed was a cataclysm, a verbal storm that left no part of our relationship untouched. She accused me of harboring dangerous fantasies, of being on This confrontation marked a turning point. The fragile hope I had nurtured, that my family might one day see beyond the surface and recognize the depth of my passion and pain, was extinguished. In its place grew a resolve hardened by rejection and misunderstanding. The breach between my inner world and the reality of my home life had widened too far to bridge, pushing me further into the shadows of my own mind, where the only acceptance I found was in the darkest corners of my imagination. In the solitude of my room, amidst the tumult of emotions following the confrontation with my mother, a dangerous resolve took root within me. The chasm of misunderstanding between us had deepened to a point of no return, and the isolation I felt from my peers seemed an insurmountable gulf. It was in this moment of utter despair that a pivotal decision crystallized in my mind. If words and explanations had failed to bridge the gap between my inner world and the outside, perhaps action would speak louder than any attempt at dialogue. The fantasies that had been my refuge, the detailed plans and sketches that filled my journal, suddenly seemed like the only path forward. Driven by a distorted sense of purpose, I began to meticulously plan the actualization of my fantasies. The thought process was alarmingly clear, as if the steps to take were laid out before me, each one leading inexorably to the next. It was no longer enough to imagine the transformative power of my hands. I craved the acknowledgement of that power, the recognition and acceptance I was convinced it would bring. This delusion, that my actions could somehow mend the fractured relationships in my life, pushed me further into the abyss. I selected my patient with a cold, clinical detachment that belied the turmoil inside me. It was someone from school, a peer who, in my distorted view, I believed could benefit from my intervention, someone whose physical imperfections I had fixated on in my journal entries. The irony that I sought to fix in others what I felt was irreparably broken in myself was lost in the fog of my obsession. My preparations were methodical, a reflection of the countless hours I had spent immersed in surgical texts and videos. I gathered the necessary tools with a chilling efficiency, stealing them from the biology lab after hours. Each piece was carefully chosen for its intended purpose, echoing the procedures I had studied with such fervor. I planned every detail with precision, from the location to the timing, ensuring that my actions would leave no room for failure. This plan, born of desperation and a twisted quest for acceptance, was my final gambit. In my mind, it was a grand, albeit dark, gesture that would force the world to see me, to acknowledge the depth of my passion and the lengths to which I was willing to go for recognition. The rational part of me, buried under layers of rejection and pain, whispered warnings of the madness of this course. Yet, it was the louder voice of my obsession that guided my actions, propelling me toward an act that blurred the line between fantasy and reality in the most terrifying way. Under the cover of darkness, when the halls of the high school echoed with the silence of emptiness, I enacted the first step of my plan with a heart pounding not from fear, but from a misguided sense of purpose. The biology lab, once a place of mere academic pursuit, transformed into the source of my illicit operation. I knew exactly where Mr. Henley kept the surgical tools for dissection locked in a cabinet whose location he'd carelessly revealed during one of our lessons. With a lockpick set I had ordered online, under the guise of a hobby, I quietly breached the cabinet's defenses, my actions fueled by an adrenaline that seemed to affirm the righteousness of my cause. The tools, scalpels, forceps, clamps, and sutures felt heavy in my backpack, each one a tangible step towards the realization of my dark ambition. As I exited the lab, the weight of my cargo was not just physical but symbolic, marking the point of no return. The night was unusually quiet as I made my way home, the tools of transformation secured, the plan set into motion. My chosen patient was a classmate named Ellie. In the solitude of my room, I had often pondered who among my peers would be the subject of my misguided quest for acceptance. Ellie, with her shy demeanor and the noticeable scar that marred her cheek, a remnant of a childhood accident, had unwittingly become the focus of my fixated mind. In my distorted perspective, I believed that by correcting this imperfection, I would not only transform Ellie's life, but also compel her and others to see me in a new light. The following days were spent in meticulous preparation. I studied Ellie's routine, noting the quiet path she took home from school, a secluded route that promised the privacy my plan required. I rehearsed every step, visualizing the procedure in my mind, each action deliberate and precise. This wasn't mere fantasy, it was a rehearsal for what I convinced myself was an act of transformation, not just for Ellie, but for me as well. In my room, surrounded by medical texts and the stolen surgical tools, I prepared my makeshift operating room. I laid out the instruments with sterile precision on a clean cloth, each one gleaming under the lamplight. My hands trembled not with nerves but with anticipation. In those moments, I was not Pauline, the outcast, the misunderstood. I was the architect of change, the bearer of a new beginning. This preparation phase was cloaked in a surreal sense of detachment, as if I were observing someone else's actions, not my own. Yet, it was me who had set this plan in motion, me who had chosen this path of darkness and a twisted quest for light. The night before the act, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the tools by my bedside silent witnesses to the precipice on which I teetered. Tomorrow, I would cross a line from which there was no return, propelled by a desire to be seen, to be understood, to be accepted. In that quiet before the storm, I found a perverse peace, a calm before the inevitable upheaval my actions would unleash. The day dawned much like any other, with the sun casting its indifferent light across the suburban landscape, unaware of the darkness it was about to witness. My morning passed in a blur, each moment edged with a razor-sharp focus on the task ahead. School was a distant hum, my interactions mechanical, my mind singularly occupied with the act one was poised to commit. The final bell rang with a clarity that seemed to echo my resolve. I made my way to the secluded path, my backpack a silent testament to the deed I was about to undertake. As I waited, hidden by the shadows that the afternoon sun cast, my thoughts turned inward. This was more than an act of transformation, it was my bid for connection, for recognition. I convinced myself that in performing the surgery, in removing Ellie's scar, I would not only be gifting her a new beginning, but also cementing my place in the world. The thought was a beacon, guiding me through the storm of my doubts and fears. Ellie appeared, her steps unhurried, her presence unwittingly pivotal in the narrative I had constructed. My heart beat a frantic rhythm, but my hands were steady, the tools ready. I approached, my voice barely a whisper as I called her name. The surprise in her eyes turned to confusion, then fear, as I revealed my intent. I tried to explain, to make her see the beauty in the act one was about to perform, but the words sounded hollow even to my ears. The struggle was brief, my preparations had not included the possibility of resistance. Panic fluttered in my chest, a bird trapped in a cage, as I realized the chasm between my fantasies and the reality I was forcing upon us. But the momentum of my actions, driven by months of isolation and obsession, could not be halted. The tools, so carefully selected and prepared, became extensions of my deluded will. I won't detail the act itself, to do so would be to relive a horror that words cannot encapsulate. Suffice it to say, the reality was a far cry from the clinical precision of my fantasies. There was no moment of triumph, no sudden swell of acceptance and understanding. There was only the stark, horrifying realization of what I had become in my quest for connection, a monster, clad in the guise of a savior. As the enormity of my actions crashed over me, I was pulled from the dark depths of my obsession by the sound of sirens, distant at first, then all-consuming. The tools, once symbols of my transformational aspirations, lay discarded, stained with the undeniable evidence of my folly. I was no architect of change, no bearer of new beginnings. I was a child, lost in a darkness of my own making, my delusion shattered by the light of truth. In the aftermath, as I was led away, the weight of my actions settled upon me, a burden I would carry for the rest of my days. The look in Ellie's eyes, a mirror of the horror and betrayal I felt within, would be etched into my memory forever. I had sought connection, recognition, acceptance, but in the end, I found only the profound depth of my own alienation and despair. This act, born of a desire to be seen, had rendered me invisible, a shadow condemned to linger on the fringes of a world I could no longer touch. The aftermath of my actions unfolded with a swiftness that left me reeling, a spectator to the chaos I had unleashed. News of the incident spread through the community like wildfire, a shockwave that left no one untouched. The horror of what had transpired on that secluded path, under the guise of a twisted redemption, became the subject of whispered conversations and overt condemnations. My name, once merely the signature of an invisible girl, became synonymous with an act so heinous it seemed to defy understanding. My family, thrust into the unforgiving spotlight of public scrutiny, grappled with a torrent of emotions. Disbelief and horror etched deep lines of anguish on my parents' faces. The community's reaction was a maelstrom of anger, fear, and incomprehension. Schools held assemblies to discuss the events, offering counselors to students who, like Ellie, had walked the same halls as I did, their sense of safety irrevocably shaken. Vigils were held, not just for Ellie, but for the lost innocence of a town that had believed itself immune to such atrocities. The discussions weren't limited to the tangible impacts of my actions, they delved into the deeper, more unsettling questions of what could drive one of their own to such darkness. Amidst the outcry, a narrative began to form, one that painted me not just as a perpetrator of violence, but as a cautionary tale. Parents clutched their children a little tighter, eyeing the quiet, introverted ones with a new wariness, as if solitude itself was a precursor to madness. Teachers revisited their roles, questioning whether signs had been missed in the rush to maintain the facade of normalcy. The community sought answers in the face of an act that seemed inexplicable, a desperate attempt to regain some semblance of control. For my family, the ordeal was a labyrinth of grief, confusion, and guilt. Questions of how could we not have seen? And where did we go wrong? Lingered in the air, unanswerable but omnipresent. My parents, once proud defenders of our family's normalcy, were now pariahs, isolated by the very community they had been a part of. The home that had witnessed my growing isolation now stood as a monument to their shattered lives, a constant reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded. The discovery of my horrific act marked a turning point, not just for me, but for everyone who had known me, directly or indirectly. The shock of what I had done created ripples that extended far beyond the immediate circle of my family and Ellie's. It forced a reckoning with uncomfortable truths about isolation, mental health, and the unseen struggles that can lead to unthinkable outcomes. In the wake of my actions, the community was left to grapple with the haunting question of how life, so seemingly mundane, could veer so disastrously off course. The moment of my arrest was a surreal procession of events, a blur of handcuffs, flashing lights, and the somber faces of officers who looked upon me not as a child, but as someone who had crossed an unfathomable boundary. The ride to the station was a journey through my own personal purgatory, each turn of the wheels, a stark reminder of the irreversible path I had chosen. Sitting in a sterile interrogation room, the weight of my actions descended upon me with the crushing inevitability of a verdict yet to be pronounced. The reality of my situation, the gravity of the harm I had inflicted, became a cage from which there was no escape. Meanwhile, my mother found herself navigating a tempest of emotions that threatened to consume her. Her devastation was a palpable entity, a grief so profound it seemed to echo through the very halls of our home. She was torn, caught in the chasm between the love she bore for me, her daughter, and the horror of the act one had committed. This duality became her prison, each moment a battle between the instinct to protect and the overwhelming sense of betrayal at what I had done. In the days that followed, as legal proceedings began to take shape and the media circled like vultures over a carcass, my mother grappled with a reality that seemed to mock the dreams she had once held for our family. Her pain was etched into every line of her face, a visible manifestation of an internal struggle that offered no respite. Conversations with lawyers and strained visits behind glass partitions in the detention center became the new normal, a grotesque parody of the parent-child relationship we once shared. The sight of her, so broken, so irrevocably altered by my actions, was a mirror to the devastation I had wrought not just on Ellie and her family, but on my own. Each visit, each attempt at conversation, was a reminder of the unbridgeable gap between us, a chasm widened by my own hands. Her love, enduring as it was, battled with the horror and repulsion of the act one had committed, a war with no victors, only casualties. This ordeal, marked by the sterile environment of courtrooms and the cold reality of legal terminology, stripped away any remaining illusions of normalcy. My mother, once a beacon of strength and stability, now navigated a world turned upside down, where her child was a stranger, and her role as a protector had been rendered moot by my own hand. The love that had once defined our relationship was now a labyrinth of guilt, regret, and sorrow, a journey through darkness with no promise of dawn. In the stillness of a room that feels more like a cell than a sanctuary, I sit and pen these final words, a testament to a journey that began in the shadows and ended in a darkness deeper than I could have ever imagined. Time here is a strange creature, stretching and contracting with the rhythm of my thoughts, which are my constant companions in the solitude. Reflection has become my penance, a process through which I sift through the debris of my actions, searching for understanding in the ruins. The world outside moves on, its pace relentless, a stark contrast to the stagnant air that fills my space. Yet, in this isolation, I found a clarity that eluded me in the chaos of the outside world. I understand now, with a painful acuity, the magnitude of my transgressions, the irrevocable harm I inflicted not just on Ellie, but on all those who were caught in the ripple effects of my actions. The realization does not come as a revelation, but as a gradual acceptance of my own role in this tragedy. My mother, who visits with a frequency that speaks more of her enduring love than of any obligation, carries the scars of our shared ordeal with a quiet dignity. The conversations we have are marked by a cautious navigation of the chasm between us, a dance around the edges of an abyss we both fear. Yet, in her eyes, I sometimes catch a glimpse of the unspoken bond that remains, battered and bruised but enduring. Her love, a beacon in the darkness, serves as a reminder of the human capacity for forgiveness, a testament to the strength of the heart. I've come to understand that redemption is not a destination but a journey, one marked by the small, often painful steps we take towards becoming better versions of ourselves. The path I chose led me to a precipice from which there was no turning back, a fall from which I am still learning to rise. The fantasies that once provided escape have lost their allure, replaced by the stark reality of my circumstances and the understanding that true connection cannot be forged in the crucible of delusion. As I write these final words, I do so with the knowledge that my story is a cautionary tale, a narrative that speaks to the dangers of isolation and the dark corners of the mind left unchecked. It is my hope that in sharing my journey, others might find the courage to reach out before crossing lines from which there is no return. My future is a question mark, a series of unknowns that stretch out before me, daunting yet imbued with the potential for growth and change. In this epilogue of my own making, I find not closure, but the beginning of a new chapter, one written with the full awareness of the past, but with eyes turned towards the possibility of redemption. The road ahead is long, fraught with challenge.